Hello there, and welcome to Star Wars Music Minute, the show that celebrates Star Wars through music and sound. Each episode revolves around 5 cinematic minutes, so by the end of the season, you will hopefully know something about the music in every minute of the current film we're on. I'm Chrysanthi Tan, a musician and longtime Star Wars fan, and today's show is all about minutes 6 through 10 of The Last Jedi. I'm flying solo for this episode, well, me and my piano, actually, because I want to introduce you to some of the foundational ideas that I think will really pay off later. These are the things that if you learn them now, it'll make so much sense down the line when they keep recurring. Most of all, I want to go over the leitmotifs that show up in this scene and make them crystal clear for you, so when they come up later, not only in The Last Jedi, but when you hear them in also The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, you will be able to recall them more instantly, if that's something you want, at least. So there's going to be a lot of musical examples today. I'm going to play the main melodies, the main themes that show up. And as always, ask me if you have any questions or if I went too fast. This is a new show, so definitely still trying to learn the pacing that I should go at. But in any case, something interesting about The Last Jedi is that it has more leitmotifs than any other Star Wars film. I know that's kind of wild, but even in the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, there aren't as many leitmotif moments as there are in this one. In fact, if I pull up the thematic census, which I'll explain later, let's see. Episode 1, for example, has 95 themes that come up. Episode 2 has 68. Episode 3 has 96. Episode 4 has 107, etc. The Last Jedi has 266. So this film is chock full of leitmotifs. Okay, before I dive into that, I want to share a little bit of the point of view that I'm coming from, because this is a new show, so I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. I used to perform sometimes in this cool concert series called What Makes It Great? Trademark, What Makes It Great? And basically, we would perform on stage for a live audience, and this NPR/PBS commentator named Rob Capello would do a presentation after we did the performance. And he would explain to the audience everything that was going on. He would basically spell out the themes that are happening. He would deconstruct the movements and then put them back together. And it was really fun. We'd stay on stage and do demos whenever he'd call on us. And, it was all rehearsed and everything. It was a very fun show/lecture presentation learning hour. And at the end, we would play the piece again, Vivaldi's Four Seasons was what I did one time. We did Vivaldi's Four Seasons again at the end, but this time the audience was equipped with so much knowledge and so many gems, and they just always left those performances feeling so equipped to listen to this piece of music, feeling like it was really part of their emotional, I don't want to say vocabulary, but people would walk away from the experience definitely feeling genuinely more appreciative of the music they had just heard. So why do I bring this up? Well, those concerts were a real honor to be a part of, not just because they were fun, but they also really influenced the way that I thought about music and the way that I talk about music to people after that. I really aim to demystify music as much as possible because I believe that music is for everyone, and having musical opinions is a territory that everyone should feel comfortable entering, not just people who can read music or are super trained and all of that stuff. So the name of that series, What Makes It Great, haunts me. And since it's a trademark and everything, I think about it a lot. And it haunts me because I think searching for greatness and chasing after greatness is a losing battle. And I'd like to get away from that, which is very hard to do when we're talking about John Williams music because, I mean, he's really a master of his craft. But the thing is, there are many reasons to admire John Williams. And I feel like I don't know, the president of the John Williams fan club sometimes. But I do want to avoid slipping into hero worship whenever possible. Because that's a disservice to the material. It's a disservice to critical thinking, and I think it's just a trap in general. So, what makes it great is not the framing of this podcast. Instead, I want to direct our energy to thinking about, and I will point out, like, simply what is happening. What are the many ways to describe what we are hearing? What is happening? What is the music doing? Whether it's good or bad or genius or whatever, what is it doing and what's the effect that it's having? I think starting from that point is more helpful and more accessible in terms of embarking on your own musical analysis if maybe you are new to it, or even if you're not new to it. It helps me for sure to, instead of think about, providing a case for why someone is genius or not, it really helps me to just break it down and think like, what is happening? Is there a pattern? And just really start looking at smaller things and things that are not just subjective, but also objective. And then just let things sort of unveil slowly after that, if need be. So just something to think about. Music analysis is a very subjective endeavor. So I do want to be conscious of doing this show, and I don't want you to walk away thinking that, like, I'm so smart, I analyzed everything so well, and my analysis is exactly right, and it was all intentional, and part of some grand plan. Because no, if I'm analyzing something, it's what I've deemed to be my opinion, but I will try to separate fact from opinion. Are we good? Good with that? Okay. Leitmotifs. A leitmotif is a musical phrase that's associated with a particular character or idea that recurs throughout a body of work. And that part's important. It's not just a theme that is one time. It's something that comes back again and again. Both parts of that definition are important. It's also not just something that comes up again and again. It's something attached to a specific idea. For the purpose of this podcast, I'm going to just call it motifs and themes for short, because even though there are musicological distinctions, I don't actually think it's very important for our purposes of conversation. But if people have further questions about that or want to talk about it more, or if a guest comes on and has other opinions about it, then I'm certainly open to reopening that can of worms and going deeper into it. But for now, just know, if I say theme or motif, I'm not really being too rigorous about it unless I specify. It's basically like not all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. That's how it is with leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are like the square. And then not all themes and motifs are necessarily leitmotifs. But I digress. The analysis of Star Wars music, and much of film music, much of music, full stop, is subjective to a degree of lots of disagreement amongst musicologists. Moreover, since John Williams himself hasn't released his own encyclopedia of leitmotifs, although Disney/Lucasfilm, if you want to put together a musical or a sonic dictionary for Star Wars, call me. Anyway, there are no universally agreed upon, for sure this is a leitmotif, for sure this is intentional, and for sure this means this and that. So the consideration of it largely depends on what each, analyzer, musicologist, viewer, listener notices and deems worthy of pointing out. The names of things can change too. Like one person might call something the hero theme and someone else might call it the rebel theme or whatever. But since this is not an exact science, we just have to pick names, and I think it helps to pick names and just stick with them, just, maintain some internal consistency. So for this show, I believe not just this episode, but moving forward, I am going to be using a specific resource that I will share with you. Let me get the name. Yeah, okay. I'm going to use the naming conventions laid out so comprehensively by a musicologist named Frank Lehman. And the reason I'm going to use his namings is because he maintains an up-to-date Star Wars thematic catalog, and he makes it available for free on his website. And it's also on academia.edu. I like how it's organized. I'll definitely link to it in the show notes if you want to check it out. It is heavy on the musical notation. Oh, wow, lights just died. Okay. It is heavy on the musical notation, but even if you don't read music, I think you will find the thematic census, I think on page 64-ish, pretty interesting. And that's what I was referring to a few minutes ago. Basically, it has a list of all the cues. I'm losing my voice, sorry. Has a list of all the cues and the episodes, and it tallies how many times each, not cue, but each motif happens in each episode. So I find it super handy. And with that, I want to point out the main motifs that take place in this moment of the film, because we're still at the beginning of The Last Jedi, and we're, in this it's a big action sequence. This entire 5 minutes is action, and the Resistance is in full force. So this is when we really have a barrage. Is that how you say it? Barrage? We are inundated with Resistance themes. The first one is the Resistance March. And it happens, let's see, let me look at my note. It happens so often in this film and in this sequence that once I play it for you, you will probably not be able to unhear it. The first time it happens, I believe it's 7:44 after the dialogue, Captain, Resistance bombers approaching. All right. So I'm going to play it. Let me know if you recognize it. I think this is a notable theme for a couple reasons. For one, it is pretty well developed. Like, it's not just like some of the themes that I will play a little bit later, where they're very short and, well, you'll hear in a second. But also, notice that this melody rises. It starts in one place, and it, over the course of, that 2 bars or whatever it is, it goes from down here to an octave up. You'll notice that the last chord is not the same as the first chord. The first chord in this demonstration, though of course it can be played in many different keys, but the relationship between chords within one key remains the same, if that makes sense. So I'm playing it in A minor right now. It starts on A minor. So for those who know any sort of music theory or harmonic analysis of any sort, you will recognize this as Roman numeral 1. If not, don't worry about it. It's just the root key, the main key, just the key is all you need to know. It starts with what's called a 1 to 5 in music speak, and then I'll explain. Goes from A minor to E major. So basically, and then it stays. That is a very common chord progression. I mean, I wouldn't say it's not even like a huge progression. It's just, it'll be very recognizable to you. Usually when a song or a phrase ends, it ends with what's called a cadence. And in a cadence, not only is the final chord memorable and, what people hang on to in analysis, but the preceding chord is also pretty important. And the transition from the second to last chord and the last chord is what makes, that whole thing is the cadence. And that is, that is something that defines many melodies, many themes. And, as we keep going through these themes throughout this movie, you'll notice how the distinctions, because John Williams writes very distinct harmonies, which we'll get into later. And I don't just mean distinct like fancy. I mean like even his chord progressions can be seen as a bit of themes, that different motifs might share the same chord structure or chord signature. And that in itself, the chord signature, it's like an inception of themes. That in itself is like, might represent a bigger idea. I'll give an example because I feel like that just confused. I may have lost people there. For example, I don't have it in front of me, but like he has a sort of chord progression for villainy, things that are villainous. Several different motifs that espouse the villainy idea will use that. And same with the heroism and all the other things. You may have noticed sometimes when you're humming themes, especially in the original trilogy, you might notice that the initial leap in notes, like you might start humming one theme and then switch to another because something about them is similar, even if they're not the same theme. And what you're probably hearing is that they share a thematic chordal association. With that, I'm going to play the Resistance March again, because again, I do want to make sure that we are really familiarizing ourselves with these themes so that when they come up later, it's very satisfying. Note that chord. That's also an interesting chord. It's a B diminished chord. And then the end of this is a mirror to the beginning. So, well, sort of, actually. So this goes F major to E major. F major is related to A minor. So you could also think about it as, oops, fail. So before, when we started like this, it basically ends like this. Sorry. Yeah. And it basically ends without resolving. That's a better way to describe it. It's hard to explain music stuff on an audio podcast. So in my mind, you may see this differently based on the evidence that has been presented. In my mind, that makes me feel like this Resistance March can just be repeated over and over and over again, because this chord lends itself to this chord in Western harmony. Do you hear how it just feels like it can keep going? All right. So the next thing that I want to bring up is actually super interesting because it doesn't show up on the soundtrack. I actually had to do a little bit of a double take when I was rewatching the movie, because there was so much in it that I just didn't recognize from the soundtrack, and this is one of them. I don't know why it is not included, but let me play it for you. And before I reveal what it is, maybe just think to yourself if you recognize it. I'll play it again. This shows up in 7, 8, and 9. So The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker. It is Poe's theme. Apparently he has a theme that is absent from the soundtrack. I would love to know the reasoning for that. I really would. It makes me wonder, given the conversation with Erica last week, if that was added later. But I don't think so, if it must have been in The Force Awakens. I don't know. We'll have to get to the bottom of this. If anyone knows of a guest who would know about this, please let me know so I can contact them and have them clear some of this up. Anyway, if you don't recognize it too much, it may be because you just haven't watched The Last Jedi too many times, because you would not know it just listening to the soundtrack. This theme actually surprised me because it sounds more, to me, it sounds happier than I would have expected a character like Poe. I don't know. What do you think? Well, it definitely shows up in this theme. I think maybe instrumentation plays into what makes it work. Not what makes it great, but what makes it work. If you watch the movie, it's basically when Poe is, having a number of heroic moments. This theme is very horn heavy in this scene. Now you know. I'm only going to do 2 more, I think, because these are like main strongholds, and almost all of them are resistance. So this is like a very resistance motif heavy episode because it's everywhere. I want to read you something that the musicologist Frank Lehman wrote regarding this next theme that I'm going to play. So I'm going to play a theme called tension. Tension is what it's called. And here's what he says. The ubiquitous tension motif, first used in TFA, provides an intervallic precursor to more long-breathed desperation theme in The Last Jedi. We haven't gotten there yet. Even by itself, the tension motif completely saturates The Last Jedi score. I think that is an interesting way to not only put that, but it makes me now want to rewatch the film with a special ear out for this motif. Because I think it underscores a lot of what's happening in this film, which is tension, not just, with the usual attacks and tension between characters, but this film in a very thematic and a very broad way it's a middle. It's one of the middle trilogy films. Those are always kind of rife with development and struggle and, I don't know, just a lot of things being called into question. And needless to say, tension in the Star Wars fandom. So I will play it. Well, that's one of them. There's actually two tension themes. I'll play the other one. It goes to other keys too. And back. So the things that I want to point out here are the staticness of each pattern. It doesn't move like the resistance march. It really stays in place. Until it moves. But it moves all in one chunk and keeps doing the same small closed pattern. That always reminds me of like when you're running in place, or when, you know, when things are tense and they're not expansive enough to move long distances. They're really like locked into a holding pattern. I feel like this resembles a holding pattern, at least for me. And John Williams uses them in a unlimited repetition. So, you know, I'm even looking at the way that Frank Lehman has written this out, and he rightfully puts repeat bars, basically a repeat sign. So you can just kind of repeat it ad nauseum almost. The other thing is the rhythm. It's in 3, and it has triplets, which I feel like, well, they always make me smile in Star Wars, but 1, 1, triplet, 1 and 2, 3, 1, 2, wow, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 E and 2 and a. I'm going to stop doing that example because me counting and playing it at the same time is not working out great. But just know that it has a triplet in the middle. And sandwiched on the outside, or I guess the triplet, it's a triplet sandwich with duplets on the outside. So basically it's 2/8 note, triplet, 2/8 note. So the triplet is something that usually when people are counting triplets, certainly musicians, it's easiest to think only in triplets. So I'd go triplet, 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 triplet. Triplet just means, by the way, sorry for not explaining earlier, it just means there are 3 notes squeezed into one beat. So if this is the tempo, 1, 2, 3, 4, it would be triplet, triplet, triplet. Whereas usually it would be da, 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 more commonly, I should say. Or da, 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 da. Multiples of 2 are, you know, usually we learn how to play those earlier than multiples of 3 just because it's harder. And then mixing the 2 can be tricky, not just conceptually, but it's tricky to play on time. So if it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1 and triplet, 1 and triplet, 3 and 1 and 2, 2, 2, 3, 1 and 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. So the pacing of the middle beat basically has more squeezed into it. So make what you will of that, but I think it is interesting that the tension motif is a triplet sandwich. Trademark. The next theme, I think this is the final one that I'll go over today, and then I'll review them all at the end. This one is, well, it's not a leitmotif, technically. It could be upgraded to a leitmotif depending on who is analyzing the score. But it's really an incidental piece of music that pops up when the resistance is deployed to do something. It's called resistance deployed. Pulling it up. I should know what it is because it's very short. I just want to make sure that I'm thinking of the right one. Oh, here we go. There's a lot of similarities between that and the tension one. They're not obviously as fleshed out as something like the Resistance March or Poe's theme or like Luke and Leia or Yoda. Those are like full on leitmotifs that are hummable, that are like a whole thing. This is very much like, oh, this happens, like it happens during action and things like that. But it's not necessarily something that you hum as like this being my favorite theme. Still, it doesn't mean that it's not felt. If you need help recalling, like placing this in your head, think horns. It's very horn heavy. And there's a rest on beat 1, so it's a little bit offset. So I'll try to portray that. 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. 2. 1. 1. 1. Again, that is something that can be sprinkled in at any point, I feel. I'm going to go over all 4 of them one more time. And I want you to pay attention to the length of the themes, how much they travel note-wise. One way to think about that is if you're trying to hum it, how big does your range need to be? Can you hum the whole thing, or is it like goes from like low to high and you run out of range? And then think about the tempo, the rhythm, and whether you can imagine this theme being prime sonic territory in a scene, or whether you feel like it might be background or accompanied by a lot of sound design. So, Resistance March. Poe's theme. Tension. Resistance deployed. Great themes. More importantly, I feel that they are established with such clarity that by the end of the film, they feel familiar, even if we can't determine where exactly they came from. In fact, when I started listening to the Resistance March again, I wasn't fully sure if it was resistance or if it was like a rebel theme, because it almost reminded me of something that I recognized so deeply without even knowing the name of what people were calling the theme. And the framework is helpful for me moving forward. The last thing I want to talk about is, in general, this scene is very, very, very busy. It's tremendous action, A lot is happening. There are sounds coming from everywhere. So it's a little bit hard to hear the score that's happening. At the same time, the score never stops. So amidst all of the sound design, amidst all of the bombing and the shooting and the, change in scenery and the shouting and all the things happening, you can still hear that there is music happening. So I want to talk a little bit about the balance of that. I did watch interviews with the sound supervisors, Matthew Wood and Ren Kleiss, I think his name is. I hope I got that right. Ren Kleiss. And they talked about this scene, actually. They talked about how the bombers were based off of World War II bombers, basically. And the interesting thing is they actually had to really manipulate the sounds that they were, borrowing from World War II footage and, just whatever they could find to emulate World War II bomber sounds. Because a lot of the fleet, a lot of the ships, a lot of the things that are happening in this very busy scene are new ships. I mean, TIE fighters are obviously not new. That already has sound. But for every new thing that enters the Star Wars universe, it's not just, visual and, costume and what colors it's going to be and what's going to be the, how big is that ship going to be and what functionality, what's it called, those types of things. For every ship that is introduced in Star Wars, you have to consider that a new sound has to be introduced as well if you see it on screen. And this goes for not just ships, but droids and anything in the Star Wars universe. Even, are there Star Wars rocks? Are there rocks in Star Wars? Even if you're like going to hit a rock or something, someone has to create the sound that rock is going to make. And so the bombing, the shooting, all the stuff in this scene was very intentional. But it's very messy. It's very busy. I shouldn't say messy. The reason it's not messy is because they had to look at a frequency spectrum when mixing these sounds and when designing these sounds. And at first, not all of the sounds were coming through. Do you ever listen to things? It happens to me when I'm listening to podcasts sometimes, where even though everyone is the same volume, for some reason, someone's voice doesn't cut through in the same way as other people's voice. Or for some reason, I just have trouble separating where the sound source of everything is from, or everything ends up, kind of sounding the same. That is because, musicians and in movies and everything, you have to be very intentional about making sure you represent sounds from the low end of the frequency range spectrum to the high end. So if, say, all the bombs that you're trying to, create sounds for are in the same mid-range or in the same exact bass, then they're not going to come through. You're not going to hear the clarity, no matter how loud you make them. They're going to be competing for each other in that same frequency band. So what they did for this scene is they had to pitch up a lot of the sounds that they created, because they all sounded kind of in that low mid-range. It would be like having an orchestra with only violas, or a song that has no bass and like no high, no little treble at the top. You need it all. I mean, you don't need it, but if you want something balanced that doesn't stick out as being really heavy in one area, it behooves you to represent them all, especially if you want the clarity. So I just thought that was interesting. And the sound mixing in this scene, it must have been extremely difficult to do, because there's so much going on. Then you have to balance that with the score too. In future episodes, maybe I'll go more into the balance of that, because composers sometimes have to really negotiate with sound designers, actually, what they're going to write, because composers and artists and bands and anyone who's on the creative side of things, will try to write their own highly representative spectrum. Think about a band recording something. They probably will want to have a bass, a guitar, maybe like a piano, maybe drums, but maybe a singer who sings higher than the others. But, things serve different roles. You're not going to have a band with just 10 bass players. I mean, you are just, I'm not talking about the exceptions. But sound designers, when they're designing sounds, they have to compete with the score and vice versa. So I've heard many cases where the sound designer was like, can you please take out that piccolo section because I have, birds that need to be in the scene and you can't hear them because of that. They're competing. So those negotiations definitely take place. Note to self, got to get a sound designer on the show. I should ask Matthew Wood or Ren Kleiss. If anyone has a connection, hit them up. Seriously though, it's a group effort, and putting together the sound for a film like this is a monumental task. On that note, I think that's about it for today. I hope this was illustrative. I hope it made sense. And I hope you learned some of the themes. I will tell you, if you can remember only two, try to remember Resistance March and Tension. It will serve you well later in the film. Thanks again to Frank Lehman for his wonderful Star Wars thematic catalog that I've referenced here today. Also got to get him on the show. And of course, thank you to Pete and Alex from Star Wars Minute for being the inspiration for this. Not thank you to those watching on YouTube. I mean, yes, thank you to you, but not thank you to my lights that died at the very beginning of this episode. So sorry that I'm in the dark, but hopefully the piano part is well lit. What else can I say? Oh, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. At this point, we're on all the podcasting platforms and also YouTube. And you can find me on Twitter or Instagram, or email me at podcast@starwarsmusicminute.com if you have questions or requests for me to cover. I would love to answer individual questions and even make, videos addressing some of them outside of main episodes. Or, your requests can help me guide who I ask to come on the show. Thank you so much. This is really fun. The next episode will be next week. Minutes 11 through 15 of The Last Jedi. And with that, I'm Chrysanthi. Thanks for joining me on Star Wars Music Minute.